The night was quiet, too quiet for a city at war. The streets of London, once filled with the laughter of markets and the clatter of horse carts, now echoed only with the hum of distant engines and the uneasy silence that came before the storm. It was September 7, 1940, the first day of what would become known as the Blitz. The people of London had learned to live with fear. The sound of the radio was their only constant companion, the voice of calm amid chaos. That evening, as families gathered in their small living rooms, the air was thick with the scent of coal and the heavy weight of anticipation. Somewhere above the clouds, German bombers were on their way. At number 12 Brixton Lane, a family sat huddled around a dim oil lamp. Thomas Bennett, a railway worker turned air raid warden, adjusted his arm, and as his wife Margaret handed him a cup of tea, their daughter, little Emily, sat on the floor clutching a stuffed rabbit, its ears half torn from age. "Will it be bad tonight, Daddy?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas smiled faintly, though the lines on his face betrayed the truth. "It'll be over before you know it, love. London's been through worse," but even as he spoke, he knew that wasn't true. Nothing in his lifetime had prepared him for what was coming. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the first sirens wailed long, rising notes that cut through the heart like a blade. Every Londoner knew that sound by now. It meant danger. It meant death could fall from the sky. The Bennets moved quickly, grabbing their gas masks and heading for the shelter at the end of the street. The neighbors poured out of their homes, two old Mrs. Parker with her cat in a basket, young men from the pub staggering with nervous laughter, and mothers carrying crying babies wrapped in blankets. The sky over the Thames turned dark, not from clouds, but from the shadow of hundreds of enemy aircraft. Then came the first explosion. The ground shook as if the earth itself had screamed. A warehouse near the docks burst into flames, sending a pillar of smoke curling into the sky. People ducked and covered their heads as the roar of engines grew louder. The Luftwaffe had arrived, and London was their target. From his post, Thomas saw it all. The city was burning docks, factories, homes. The fire spread like a living creature, devouring everything in its path. Firefighters raced through the streets, their faces smeared with soot, hoses snaking across cobblestones. Yet no amount of water could quench the fury of that night. Inside the shelter, Margaret held Emily close as dust fell from the ceiling with every nearby blast. The air smelled of earth and fear. In the dim light, people whispered prayers for their homes, for their sons fighting abroad, for the dawn that might never come. "Do you think he's safe?" Margaret whispered to Mrs. Parker. "He's Thomas Bennett." Mrs. Parker said firmly, "He's stronger than this city," but her words trembled. Above them, Thomas moved through the chaos. He and his fellow wardens went door to door, checking basements, calling out for survivors. Once, he heard the faint cry of a child under the rubble of a bombed-out shop. He tore at the debris with his bare hands, blood mixing with dust. Beneath the broken timbers, he found a boy no older than 10, his face pale but alive. Thomas carried him to safety, his lungs burning from smoke. By midnight, London glowed red, a city of fire. The Thames reflected the flames like molten glass. The skyline was a jagged silhouette of destruction, the air thick with ash. In the distance, St. Paul's Cathedral stood against the inferno, its dome illuminated by the fires around it, defiant and unbroken. Inside the shelter, Emily had fallen asleep at last, her small head resting on her mother's lap. Margaret listened to the rumble above, her heart aching with every explosion. Then came a sound worse than any bomb, the silence between them. No one spoke, no one dared breathe. Every second of quiet could mean the bombers had turned elsewhere, or that the next wave was coming. And it came. The ground heaved as another line of bombs fell, this time closer. The shelter shuddered, the light flickered, and dust filled the air. Someone screamed. The steel door rattled like a drum. Margaret's ears rang as if the world had split open. When she looked down, Emily was still asleep, peaceful in the storm. Hours passed before the all clear sounded. The sirens wailed again, but softer this time, the signal that the bombers had gone. Margaret stepped outside with the others, blinking into the dawn's smoky haze. The air was cold, filled with the acrid scent of burning oil and brick dust. The street they had known was gone. Half the houses were reduced to rubble. Flames still danced in the distance, and the city was a maze of twisted metal and shattered glass. Somewhere a church bell rang cracked, but still ringing. Then she saw him. Thomas emerged from the smoke, his uniform torn, his face streaked with soot. For a moment he looked like a ghost, but when he saw her he smiled, that same tired, brave smile he had worn the night before. "You're safe," he whispered, pulling her close. "You and Emily, that's all that matters." Over the next days, London learned what it meant to endure. The Blitz was relentless. Every night the sirens came. Every night families descended into shelters with their blankets and ration tins, waiting for the sky to fall again. Schools closed, hospitals overflowed, and streets turned into graveyards of brick and fire. Yet the people, the ordinary men and women of London, refused to break. Thomas volunteered for every shift, patrolling through nights of flame and ruin. He pulled people from burning buildings, guided the lost through smoke-choked streets, and helped dig survivors from the rubble. Once he even stood on the roof of St. Mary's Hospital, waving a signal lamp through falling embers to guide fire engines to the scene. When asked why he risked his life again and again, he simply said, "Because someone has to." Margaret became part of the women's volunteer service, handing out tea and bandages at shelters, comforting mothers who had lost everything. Sometimes she read to the children during raids fairy tales and Bible stories, her voice trembling but steady. "If we can still tell stories," she once said, "then they haven't taken everything." As the months went on, the city changed. Streets that once smelled of rain and coal now stank of smoke and decay. Familiar landmarks were gone, theatres, schools, homes reduced to rubble. Yet in the midst of it all, London lived. Trains still ran. Milkmen still delivered bottles to doorsteps, sometimes setting them on piles of brick where a house once stood. Bus drivers returned to routes that no longer existed, steering through cratered roads with quiet pride. One night in December, the bombing reached its worst. The air was freezing, the kind of cold that made the smoke cling to the lungs. The city centre was the target: Fleet Street, the Guildhall, and St. Paul's itself. The bombers came in waves, the sky filled with their deadly hum. Searchlights crisscrossed the heavens, tracer bullets arcing upward like shooting stars. Thomas and his crew were stationed near Ludgate Hill, trying to keep the fires from spreading to the cathedral. The blaze was so fierce that even the stone of nearby buildings began to crack. The firefighters' helmets gleamed in the inferno, their silhouettes ghostly against the flames. When a high-explosive bomb struck the street beside them, Thomas was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing. He looked up to see the great dome of St. Paul's shrouded in smoke. For a moment he thought it was gone. But when the wind shifted, the clouds parted, and there it was still standing. Bathed in firelight, its cross gleamed like a star above the ruins. Thomas felt something stir in his chest then, something fierce and unbreakable. "They'll never bring it down," he whispered. By morning, London had survived another night. Barely. Hundreds were dead, thousands homeless. But the photograph that appeared in the newspapers the next day showed St. Paul's rising unscathed above the smoke, a symbol of hope. It became known as the Spirit of London. Months passed. The bombings continued through the winter, each night bringing new destruction. Yet slowly the city learned to adapt. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Shelters grew more organized. Fire brigades became faster, more efficient. The enemy could destroy buildings, but not resolve. By May 1941, the Blitz had raged for 8 months. When the final major raid came, it struck the East End once more, the docks, the factories, the homes of those who had suffered the most. Thomas was there, directing civilians to safety when the warehouse beside him exploded. He was buried under rubble, pinned by debris. The world went black. When he awoke, he was in a field hospital. Margaret sat beside him, her hands clasped around his. His legs were bandaged, his face pale. "You're alive," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "That's all I prayed for." He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it tight. The war would go on, years of struggle, sacrifice, and waiting, but the worst was over. The Blitz had failed to break London. The fires had burned, but the city still stood. Its people, bruised, scarred, grieving, had found in themselves a strength they never knew existed. Emily grew up with the memory of those nights. She remembered the sirens, the smell of smoke, the glow of her father's lantern through the cracks of the shelter door. Years later, when the war ended, she stood beside her parents as the victory bells rang across London. The city was battered, but beautiful, reborn from its ashes. She once asked her father what he remembered most about those nights. He looked out at the skyline where new buildings were rising amid the ruins. "The sound," he said softly. "Not the bombs, the people, singing in the shelters, laughing in the dark. Even when the sky was on fire, London didn't go quiet. That's what kept us alive." And so the story of the Blitz became more than just a tale of destruction. It was a story of defiance, of men and women who faced the storm and refused to yield. A story of ordinary heroes who stood together when their world was burning. When London burned, its people didn't fall apart. They stood taller, shoulder to shoulder, hearts beating as one. And though the flames scarred the city, they also forged something indestructible, the spirit of courage that would define a generation. Even now, when the night falls over London and the old sirens lie silent, the echoes remain. In the quiet streets, in the glow of the lamplight, in the hearts of those who remember, you can still hear it. The sound of a city that burned and survived.